until 1967, Brazil was dependent on foreign countries for armored vehicles. Throughout and in the aftermath of World War II, Brazil would receive large amounts of cheap armored vehicles from the United States, including the M3 Stuart and the M4 Sherman, as it had entered the war on the Allied side in 1942. In fact, Brazil had not undertaken any tank design since 1932, and those had only been conversions of tractors and cars into armored vehicles during the revolutions of 1924, 1930, and 1932. Hello and welcome to another Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. I am your host, Flair, and today I will be covering the VBB-1. If you like our videos and want to support us, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to improve future Tank Encyclopedia content. Any help would be greatly appreciated. Between 1932 and 1958, the Brazilian armed forces created a solid basis of technical institutes from which it could educate technical and research personnel. In turn, these helped the Brazilian automotive industry in developing its own automotive parts and helped in opening laboratories of the manufacturers. In 1967, Brazil set up a plan for the country to become more self-sustaining. The flow of U.S. materials had decreased because of its entanglement in the Vietnam War, and after a study, Brazil recognized external dependence on arms suppliers as a serious problem for its own political position in South America. The plan to solve this would be the start of the Brazilian defense industry. The first steps were small, from its first tracked armored vehicle meant for serial production in 1965, called the VETE T-1 A-1 Cutia, to its very first wheeled reconnaissance vehicle with production in mind, designed VBB-1 in 1967. The VBB-1 kickstarted the development of wheeled armored vehicles in Brazil, with the EE-9 Cascavel being the most successful result. The Viatura Blindada Brasileira 1 VBB-1 was developed by Parque Regional de Motomecanização da Segunda Região Militar, or the Regional Motomechanization Park of the 2nd Military Region, which was a group of Army automotive engineers gathered to study, develop, and produce armored vehicles for Brazil. For future reference, I'm going to be referring to the Parque Regional de Motomecanização da Segunda Região Militar as the Park. The park developed its vehicles under the supervision of the Diretoria de Pesquisa e Ensino Técnico Exército, or in English, the Army Directorate of Research and Technical Education. The first steps of the park, meant to gain experience, was the remotorization of vehicles like the M8 Greyhound, which received a diesel engine. From the experience gained, the park team initiated the development of a wheeled armored vehicle for reconnaissance. The reason for the park to develop a wheeled vehicle was because of a study carried out by the Diretoria Geral de Material Bélico, or the General Directorate for War Material, which called for the intensive adoption of wheeled armored vehicles for the Brazilian Army, after having studied wheeled vehicles from various other countries. These types of vehicles needed less investment and are far more feasible to develop instead of importing them. The study called for a vehicle similar to the M8 Greyhound, but simpler. The reason why the DGMB wanted a vehicle like the M8 Greyhound is because of the experience Brazil had during World War II with the vehicle. Brazil sent an expeditionary force, also known as the Smoking Snakes, to fight in Italy alongside the Allies. The Brazilians would operate the M8 during the Italy campaign, and they loved the vehicle. The positive experience with the M8 caused it to be one of the, if not the most impactful vehicles for Brazilian development of armored fighting vehicles. In 1967, the DGMB made a sketch of a 4x4 vehicle, armed with a 37mm cannon, which was mounted in a rotating turret. The Brazilian doctrine at the time called for the usage of 37mm guns on reconnaissance vehicles. It can be questioned to some extent if the DGMB might have been stuck in its ways regarding Brazil's doctrine on the 37mm, but on the other hand, the VBB-1 was never meant to be groundbreaking, or to match its counterparts of the period. The vehicle needed to have a crew of 3 to 4 members, and was to be sufficiently robust and powerful as the M8, but simpler. This was requested in order not to overburden the Park team more than they could achieve. Further demands were the use of as many off-the-shelf components as possible in order to profit from the Brazilian automotive industry and to save costs. Finally, the plan was for the chassis to eventually be modified to suit APC, anti-infantry, and anti-aircraft roles. The concept of the 4x4 VBB-1 was inspired from the Belgian FN4RM62F Auto Blindé. Although the concept was based on the Belgian vehicle, the overall design of the VBB-1 seems to have taken most of its inspiration from the M8 Greyhound. In July 1968, the team led by Lieutenant Colonel Pedro Cordeiro de Melo, who was the leader of the park, started designing the VBB-1. It would have a 4-man crew and carry spare tires on the sides of its hull. In July of 1986, the first scale mock-up was built. An interesting detail are the spare tires mounted on both sides in the middle of the vehicle. Another model was made, which removed the spare tires in the middle of the first model, replacing them with continuous side armor plate instead. This was most likely done as the next step within the development of the VBB-1, as the park had requested the development of so-called bulletproof tires. On June 3, 1968, Lieutenant Colonel de Mello requested the development of bulletproof tires, or better known as run-flat tires. These tires were developed by Novatrakshow and would be used for the BB-1. The new tire was extensively tested from March 1969 and on, and could travel for at least 500 kilometers, or 311 miles, after it was punctured. Parallel to the development of the tires was the development of the turret. The park team opted for a locally produced turret. The new turret was practically a somewhat improved copy of the M8 Greyhound turret. In contrast to the M8, the VBB-1 turret was not open-topped. Various gun mantlets were cast and presented along with the other components of the turret. A simple gun mantlet with just the main gun hole and a vision hole was selected. With the initial scale models completed, work began on the construction of the hull somewhere between July and October of 1968. It reached an advanced stage on October 25, 1968, when it was photographed. Interestingly, at this point in time, the hull was constructed in accordance with the run-flat tire concept. However, it is known that the VBB-1, of which a single vehicle was built, was initially delivered as per the spare tire concept. Why the park team decided to cut the sides of the hull for the spare tires and not wait until the run-flat tires were delivered is unknown. They probably weighed the chances of Novatrakshow developing a tire within specifications and the park team being able to finish the first concept of the vehicle. With Novatrakshow not having developed a new tire yet, they went on to develop the spare tire concept. The VBB-1 weighed 7 tons and was 5 meters long, 2.5 meters wide, and 2.3 meters tall, excluding the turret mount. In imperial units, that's 7.5 US tons, 16.4 feet long, 8.2 feet wide, and 7.55 feet tall. The VBB-1 was operated by a 4-man crew, consisting of the commander, gunner, driver, and co-driver. The VBB-1 was powered by a 6-cylinder OM321 120 horsepower diesel engine built by Mercedes-Benz. This gave the vehicle a top speed of 90 kilometers an hour, with an operational range of 1,200 kilometers or 746 miles. It had a turning radius of 7 meters or 7.7 yards and could drive up a 60-degree slope. The VBB-1 used a 37mm M6 cannon as main armament, which was able to fire the M51 armor-piercing capped shell, the M74 armor-piercing shell, the M63 high-explosive shell, and the M2 canister rounds. The VBB-1 was extensively tested during 1969 and 1970. It performed in beach trials, mobility trials, and firing tests. The vehicle performed well, but in the end would not be accepted. The reason is because the Brazilian army wanted a 6x6 vehicle, like the M8 Greyhound, and not a 4x4. Why the park developed a 4x4 instead of a 6x6 is a mystery. They most likely developed a 4x4 because it was easier and cheaper to build than a 6x6, and thus an excellent vehicle from which to gain experience. The park briefly considered cutting the VBB-1 and lengthening the hull to create a 6x6 vehicle, but the idea was almost immediately discarded. It was easier and more effective to develop a new vehicle. The VBB-1 is currently used as a gate guardian in front of the Centro Tecnológico de Exército, or, in English, the Army Technology Center. Overall, the VBB-1 seemed to have been a decent vehicle. It performed well in tests, but was outdated from its conception. The VBB-1 did not present anything new and was not better than its counterparts of its time. This was not surprising considering the goal of this project, the lack of experience of the engineers, and taking into account that this was the very first wheeled armored vehicle Brazil had ever developed with serial production in mind. But sadly, the Brazilian army did not want the VBB-1, but a 6x6 instead. The VBB-1 thus was, most importantly, a vehicle which helped advance the development of Brazilian armored vehicles and would be the stepping stone towards the famous EE-9 Cascavel and the EE-11 Urutu. And that's it for this video. If you liked it, please leave a like and subscription. You can find more information relating to this vehicle in the full article, which is linked in the description. If you like what we are doing and want to let us continue working on these videos, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be allocated to improving our articles and videos for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.